Hi everyone, welcome to Saris on Screen. I'm Usha,
And I'm Rekha.
and we're talking about politics, patriarchy, and pop culture. Catch us every other Friday as we do feminist deep dives into South Asian culture and cinema.
Welcome back to another episode of Saris on Screen. We're taking on another two-part conversation in this episode focused on rape culture and all its facets. But we believe that discussion requires us to begin with a comprehensive look at consent and non-consent in South Asia and how it's portrayed in our media.
Yeah, and it's obviously quite a bit grimmer than the previous episodes that we've taken on,
Mhm.
but we hope to take it on as sensitively as possible. But we want to add additional trigger warnings for this episode. We're going to be talking about depictions of violence, sexual assault, verbal assault, rape, and emotional abuse. We recommend that any listener who may be uncomfortable with such discussions sit this one out for their mental health and well being.
Your mental health is and always should be a priority.
Absolutely. But that being said, if you are choosing to continue, please do so carefully.
And this is clearly an important issue in South Asia and beyond, and one that has been thankfully getting a lot more attention in recent times, both in film media and TV, but also social media platforms.
I think the younger generation, at least in privileged spaces, have certainly opened up to this discussion, which is a limited space, but definitely a start.
Yeah, and I think we were planning this episode around rape culture, but we kept returning to the concept of consent and how our collective understanding of consent is one of the fundamental factors leading to rape culture in South Asia, and how much of a role our media plays in perpetrating these very flawed ideas.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's surprising to anyone really when we say that. Like we've all seen those movies. Yeah, but I think while rape culture itself is a much broader issue, we wanted to narrow in on consent itself first. And to do that, we decided that our usual format might be a little limiting because non-consent and how it is glorified in our media is just so ever present in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and I think unlike our usual format of a 3 to 5 movie lineup, we thought that we would take a slightly broader look at the media landscape this time, and the media landscape that we grew up with in, the early 2000s and the
Hmm.
2010s.
Yeah, and I think that this episode will be slightly different also in that it'll be a more personal and reflective episode compared to the usual ones. Obviously, some theory and media as always, but I think it's important to realize that how we personally interacted with these ideas were very much shaped by our circumstances and our experiences.
And I think just looking back at our own childhoods, conversations around consent were only ever discussed in terms of, sexual harassment or rape, if at all.
Mhm.
And we come from more privileged backgrounds compared to many, and even then bodily autonomy was only ever brought up in the context of purity or like family
Mhm.
honor. What will people say
Mhm.
about you if you're considered like sexual,
Yeah, and I think it's
essentially?
not just our households or anything. Like it was abundant in our media too. Like both in artsier productions and more marketable ones. Consent in cinema for the actresses was for her Izzat, and the villain, as the villain was trying to make attempts to rape her. And it was never ever about her bodily autonomy or her agency or her consent. It's very much focused on oh, her honor or her family's honor or the main actor's honor. Like it's very rarely are violations of women's consent on screen seen as something that they're experiencing as a human. It's something that's happening to an object, right?
Yeah, and nothing about being violently sexualized by multiple men, either the actor on the screen, the director behind the camera, or even the audience watching it, gives this like character or this actress a shred of consent or agency over how she's being perceived or consumed,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Yeah, it reminds me of like how when we watched Parched for our first episode, and we were talking about how Radhika Apte was in a sex scene, like fully consensually. The actress consented, the character
Mm-hmm.
in the movie consented, and the movie was very much so shot from a female gaze and everything. So you'd think that the contrast would be like great on that, like compared to what we usually get, but somehow the end iteration of it was that scene being isolated from all of its context, all of the agency and all of the female gaze of it all, and then
Yeah.
being reduced to Radhika Apte's porn scene, like and market and
Leaked.
like leaked. Yeah, leaked, because leaked implies this like voyeuristic sort of like element to it, right? That like you are getting to partake in something that this person didn't agree to, and that's how it went out, like like on all porn sites, like in India, like pretty it's up there and it's noted as that, which is that's the thing, that even when the women who are on screen or the actresses who play them are consent to like scenes like where they agree to be seen or consumed in that format, that agency is still always like culture finds society finds a way to rob them of that somehow.
Yeah, and I think this isn't like a new phenomenon either. We were recently talking about that interview of Smita Patil when she was asked by a journalist about how she felt about being, very sexualized in these very objectifying posters of her from a movie, and they were being displayed all over the country. And she talks about the voyeurism, not only what she faces as an actress, and to if I mean, to give her credit, she did mention that she was consenting to that voyeurism to some degree, but also how that feeds into everyday life for women. I mean, I think we have to note here that so many women in South Asia still don't have access to private spaces for, hygiene activities, and a lot of them have to do these things out in public, and that basically signals to men that, oh, when a woman is like trying to have a bath, it's okay to like look at her. And I mean, we've all seen those sexy rain dance scenes from like 1960s Bollywood to like 2020s Bollywood, where like a woman dancing in
Hmm.
the rain is like, or like just having a bath is like wrong and has to be
Hmm.
watched by a man.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the Smita Patil thing is also that she talks about the consumption of that image like much after and like robbed of its context, like that element of it, right? Because when it's splashed across posters and this that whatnot, she is just this like almost half naked woman like on a poster, and that is all she's reduced to in that scene moment, right? And I think she talks a bit about like how even if you consent to like one element of it, whether it's like being in the
Mhm.
scene, that doesn't mean like you're consenting to being consumed in that way.
Yeah, and even like for her, she was one of the top actresses of that time, like one of the most
Mm-hmm.
respected and best paid, also. And even for her, she barely had any agency over how her images were being,
Mm-hmm.
marketed essentially to get in more eyeballs for that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like yeah, and like the thing is that this hypersexualization and this sort of blasé acceptance of like creeping on women being the standard, like it gives like men the blueprint of like abusive behavior towards women. And the thing is that you can all argue that like, oh, well, like isn't this the same dumb argument as watching violent video games makes you like violent? It's like yes and no, because when you play a violent video game in a fantasy setting, you get to log off and go back to your day job where there's no gun for you and no like KD ratio to get up at your like bank job. Like hopefully that's not what you're doing at your like bank job. But when you repeatedly watch these like sort of voyeuristic behavior on screen be awarded positively, like, whether it's Shah Rukh Khan rifling through Kajol's underwear in DDLJ, or some creepy dude watching the actresses like babe, like Greg was talking about, like through the bushes. And like the thing is that like they all end up getting the girl at the end. Like that's just how it ends up being. And it's just really like it creates a very disturbing and concretely damaging feedback loop in
Mm-hmm.
society, and often ends up having a very dire impact on women in general, but even more so for people of marginalized
Yeah,
groups.
and it's like a snake eating its own tail in that sense, right? That you see it in the media, so you think this is okay, and then the media wants to show what's happening in reality. So there's more of this very negative like perspective on all of this. And this cycle essentially
Mm-hmm.
continues to a point where people become completely desensitized to brutal sexual violence towards other people.
Yeah, and it's like shitty because this means that getting catcalled, eve teased, or sexually harassed at work or school barely makes anyone raise an eyebrow. No other violation of bodily autonomy is ever a concern unless it involves rape, which again is never about you. It's about everyone else but the survivor, including the perpetrator. And yeah, like it's just really shitty because like this like reductive and this sort of glorification and sort of non-consent and rape culture and the desensitization that happens because of it makes everything else seem trivial in society's eyes when none of those things are trivial and are just as bad.
Exactly. And I mean, I think this is exactly why discussions about consent and personal physical boundaries are also so rare, because the conversation has been limited to and boxed to like rape and sexual violence on purpose to limit that conversation. And in a
Mhm.
society where anything, even like kind of sexual, is basically dirty, conversations around consent and before they are even allowed to begin.
With that, I think we're ready to start and look into some facets of consent in our society. And our first movie for our lineup was Sitara. And this is this animated Pakistani short made by a Pakistani Canadian director. And, it has that whole like Pixar movie feel. It's animated super beautifully and it was really amazing.
Definitely.
Like, all our patterns and textures up in like that animated format. It's only 15 minutes long, so I definitely recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it to like just go give it a watch. It's on Netflix. um
Mm-hmm.
but like it's about a very heartbreaking topic. Like it's about a forced child marriage, and like it's about a forced child marriage, and it was just like super gut wrenching. And I think that like we see the story of this little girl who like, is playing planes with her sister, like making paper airplanes and playing with her sister who's only like slightly older than her. And then the dad
Mm-hmm.
comes back and he is like, oh yeah, her marriage has been settled. And this is an entirely silent movie, like just to like point that out.
Yeah,
And
I really loved how like they indicated that she's ready for marriage through like presenting her with that shoe, because like that decorative shoe, and it like represents so much, because
mhm.
given their like socioeconomic and everything standing, this was like something that's only reserved for a special occasion,
Yeah.
which is like getting this girl married, like this
Yeah.
child married
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Yeah, and I think like we get to see like how the mom, who was also the victim of the same practice, essentially sort of be resigned as she has to sort of get her young daughter ready for the same thing that she had to go through personally. And so like we see the mom sort of silently and like somberly like dress up the girl, put henna on her hand, and then like get her ready to go to the wedding. And the mom looks really sad the entire time, and the young
Hmm.
daughter doesn't really understand what's happening until the very end. And then we have a
Hmm.
little moment where the dad feels bad, but like I'm glad that the story didn't focus on that, because like I mean it's not very redeemable,
Uh-huh.
like and
Oh
I think
yeah,
that
you can have a better shot. Like, sorry, I messed up your sister's life
yeah,
by
and your
like,
mom's like
yeah.
but we see the little girl and like we see her fly a plane, and it's just kind of left up to the air, like like um whether if she's gonna suffer from the same fate or not. But we do like, like, and I think that this movie was super sad to watch because like as we were saying that like very the silent animation of it made it almost super loud in its messaging because
Mhm.
nobody could say anything, when the
Mhm.
younger girl is sad, she can't say anything. When the mom has a problem with it, she can't say anything. The dad doesn't know how to like really say anything to the daughter because what do you even say to your kid, right? And like, we
Right.
understand that in certain parts of South Asia there are like financial and economic constraints to why like parents will justify marrying their daughters off sooner, or even like societal ones. But ultimately, like, like, I mean, I understand that this isn't just oh, you have bad parents problem. This is a society problem too, because women don't have much opportunities in our society. Like they make it so that women don't, and like it's
Yeah,
designed
and
like.
like, the whole idea of like having a daughter is like presented as a
Mhm.
burden to so many South Asian parents
Yeah,
because of, restrictions on women's education and their ability to be
yeah,
employed. So
and like.
they're like financial
Mhm.
liabilities because of the patriarchy, and that's.
Yeah. And I think like it's really sad because like I think about Bangladesh in particular this last 2 years because of COVID. Like, and Bangladesh is one of the few countries in South Asia where the literacy rates for women and young girls is actually higher than men slightly.
Mhm.
And this is the year where like, like every like COVID, and it's like when COVID hit and schools were shut down for 2 years, all these girls who are in seventh grade or eighth grade, like, or like ninth grade, their parents were just like, oh, we're not gonna make you, like, what are you gonna do sitting at home? You're a liability. Someone can come and like like sully your name by being
Mhm.
associated with you and whatnot. So it's your fault, and you're gonna drop out of school, and you're gonna get married now. And so all these girls will never go back to school. And I think that is like a greater part of this, what this movie and also what we know just generally, how like these forced young brides and whatnot of South Asia, like most of them don't get to have good like educational outcomes. Like they don't get to go back to school. They don't get to have good health outcomes. Maternity health is like abysmal for like they're literally children.
Yeah, and there are children who are like expected to like
Yeah,
yearly produce babies, like pretty
yeah.
much from the age of 14 onwards.
Having like good like access to good nutrition or anything, because in most homes women are the last people to like eat, right?
They
And when
get
you're
the
already.
leftovers, yeah.
Yeah, and when you're already a growing child, this like like what we're saying is that there is an adverse effect on overall quality of life. And this movie, as a simplified form of that, you get to see this, little girl, their dreams being crushed, and like so many girls' dreams
Yeah, this
get
is like
crushed.
millions of girls'
Yeah,
reality in South
yeah.
Asia.
And I think that this movie did a good job of making you feel that in a very short period of time. And
Mhm.
you can give credit to the movie for that. And I think that one of the discussions I think that like comes in from this is that, oh, like there's obviously like the age of consent thing, like where like this is a younger girl, and like when any conversation about consent will always have some dude who's coming in and to deflect it and talk about age of consent. And we don't really want to get into it. No, we're not saying it's not important, but that we think that age of consent laws are there for a reason. They're there to
Mhm.
protect minors from sexual abuses, predatory behavior, and from like adults taking advantage of minors. And there could be nuanced discussions about it, but I don't think some dude who's trying to deflect conversations about consent is going to try to have them with you. But yeah, like.
Yeah, and I think like over here we should also point out that like age of consent and ideas of consent are like so limited to sexual activity and sexuality. I think
Or
consent is,
marriage, like, or
or
like.
marriage or
Yeah,
forced marriage. It's never about consenting to, privacy or consenting to like having physical boundaries or
or
physical
bodily
space
autonomy,
or,
or.
yeah, any
Yeah.
kind of bodily autonomy. And we see this especially like in terms of, trans children not having being able to like have the bodily autonomy to decide when they want to undergo any kind of gender reaffirming therapies or surgery. They would still need like parental consent until the age of 18. But like these are the parts of consent that we never like
Yeah.
discuss as a society, like
Yeah. Or
whether it's South Asia or the
mhm.
West.
Yeah, and I think that, like, when we say that we don't want to talk about age of consent, we're not, like, we do want to talk about like the other elements of consent that aren't talked about. And one of the most prominent of this is like children and their like consent in terms of like physical space. Like in South Asia, it's children's physical space is not respected. Like it's not
Yeah.
respected, period. Like that is it.
Yeah, and like I mean we've all been there, right? We've all been at that random wedding or like family function where like 500 relatives all want to like give you a hug and you don't want any, but like your parents will be like, "Oh, it's okay," or like these relatives will be like, "Oh, your child is so disrespectful because they don't want to sit on my lap or give me a
Mm-hmm.
kiss." And that's like bullshit. I mean, like do we
Mm-hmm.
not care about what this child
Yeah,
wants
or
at
like,
all?
why do we never focus on the child's comfort level or their safety? And the thing is
Mhm.
that, like, like South
Or
Asia,
their
like,
perception of
mhm,
safety. I think like their perception of feeling safe is never like part of that
mhm.
conversation.
Yeah, and the thing is that I think that, if you ask any older South Asian person, they'll be like, oh, but children, it's all very innocent. Why are you perceiving it as like like a bad thing? Why are you perceiving it as bad touch? And they'll like spin it around and blame you for thinking that way. But I mean, I think, like there's a difference between coming straight out to the Western ideas of like, how touch is seen. And that's a conversation for a whole different episode that isn't our niche over here. But like looking specifically at South Asia, like it doesn't make sense to have that, ostrich head in the sand attitude about it. Because children, the majority of sexual assault and like rape like cases that are reported for children are often done by people that they know. And when you fail to recognize children's boundaries or their ability to consent in terms of their physical space or privacy or like,
Mm.
just anything else, you are refusing to acknowledge that this happens, and you're not giving them the space to come out and talk about something when something bad happens to them.
Yeah, and I think like the way that South Asia has not just like constructed conversations around around consent, but also sex and sexuality in general are like so demonizing. So a child is like immediately made to feel if even if they are being like abused by like whether it's a family member, they're made to feel like they're in the wrong because this
Hmm.
is a dirty thing. And
Hmm.
this is just like leading to like the lack of safe spaces for
Yeah.
young people, whether it's children or teenagers, to even talk about their experiences or like
Hmm.
process how they're feeling.
There's no space to talk about any of it. Like, how do you talk about consent where anything that isn't like, like heterosexual male sexuality is considered dirty, right? Because like that's the thing that like when a child wants to complain about bad touch, like the child is called dirty, not the
Hmm.
person. He's like, oh, you are a dirty child who's thinking of it in a dirty way. And it's like it's never like, and that victim blaming is part of not recognizing children's bodily autonomy. And I think that that needs to be respected, and those boundaries need to be drawn. And even if it's not to the Western degree, which is on the other end of the spectrum, there needs to be certain boundaries established just as a mid ground between the 2.
Yeah, and the shaming of parents and
Mhm.
children for like asserting
Mhm.
boundaries is also needs to stop,
Mhm.
right? Like social ostracization of kids or
Mhm.
parents who respect their kids' boundaries is like just really shitty.
Yeah, and I think another point that we, like Sitara makes you think about, that this wasn't just like a violation of the age of consent or like children's consent, like the child who's married off like her consent, but also this is like a forced marriage, right? Which is an entirely different violation of consent in its own like space.
Yeah, and even with like marriage, age of marriage laws, which is like slightly different from age of consent, the cultural systems haven't exactly like they found loopholes in these
Mm-hmm.
like laws too, right? I mean, think about like Balika Vadhu, where we see that she's married off, but she doesn't live with her like husband until like she's a little bit older, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
more legally like okay, but that didn't stop her from like becoming a child bride
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Yeah, and I think like we talked about the negative effects of it already, like how how negatively it can affect a child when they are forced into a marriage. But even looking at like adults, like if we look at like diaspora spaces, we can see like how forced marriages are rampant in like diaspora spaces, which you'd think would be rare because a lot of these women have access to education and potential financial like autonomy and everything. But even then, like the pressures that come from the sort of cultural toxicity and the manipulative sort of emotional blackmailing of like our sort of collective family based cultures, like it forces women to make a choice between, oh, you either get married to a complete stranger or you like lose your entire family. And so like well, a lot of women don't get, or sometimes they're taken to like holidays and they'll be forced to get married. Their passports will be locked up. Like, it's really fucked up. And that's the
Yeah, I
thing, like,
mean, we all saw Namaste London, where
yeah,
like Katrina Kaif like is literally forcibly married like without her knowledge.
like that's the thing that forced marriages, even for adults, like even when there isn't a violation of the age of consent, is still a violation of an adult's consent. But oftentimes, families will just assume that their consent is just there, right? Like,
Or
I mean,
they can consent on their kids' behalf,
yeah,
like
like I mean, I think about like DDLJ. This reminds me of this one scene in DDLJ where like Kajal's dad gets the letter and like they're like, oh yeah, my son has finished his bachelor's. Now he can get married to your 18-year-old who just finished high school, and the dad literally tells Kajal like, oh yeah, like the guy you've been betrothed to since you were like 5, like we're gonna go to India and we're gonna send you off even though you grew up and spent your whole life in like London. And she like runs away, and
mm.
like her mom is like looking concerned because it's a matter like you just can't drop that ball on your 18-year-old. And the dad is like, oh, like she's shy, that's how girls are supposed to be, so traditional. And it's like, what? But yeah, but that's the thing, their assumptions are they're like their consent is taken for granted.
And I think the other sort of underlying like aspect of forced marriage that we should recognize or at least note is that like forced marriage usually happens to maintain like caste boundaries and ethnic
Mm-hmm.
boundaries,
Yeah.
right? To ensure that your kid isn't gonna like lower their like
Mm-hmm.
socioeconomic status by like marrying outside of the community. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the sort of patriarchal casteist like purpose of it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like I think this like is again a continuation of that lack of recognizing consent in children, because I think South Asian parents to a degree will never recognize their children of ever having autonomy. And
Pretty
especially
much.
like girl children and women, they won't see it.
Hmm.
And I think that it's just like, oh yeah, why wouldn't she agree? And I think this brings us sort of like like, I mean, not to like keep, not that this doesn't warrant ranting about forever. I think this brings us to sort of like our next topic, like sort of like like bad segue over here. But like the thing is that the basic premise of consent is super simple. We've all seen the tea allegory, right? Oh, do you want a cup of tea? Yes, get a cup of tea. If you don't want a cup of tea, let's not ask again. It's supposed to be simple. It's very yes, no, whatnot. But I think that there are times where applications of consent and like will vary.
Yeah, and that's why we talk about like making consent verbal and clear and like
Mm-hmm.
completely like, it's something that can't be misunderstood so that both parties or like
Yeah.
all parties are aware and acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
each other's like participation or lack
Mm-hmm.
of participation,
Yeah. Yeah. Like verbal consent is so important, but and what we were saying is that, there are certain contexts where that doesn't happen or isn't allowed to happen, right? Like, not that it doesn't happen, it's not allowed to happen. And then looking at like South Asia and its culture of silence on, like, all matters of like sex in general, like it's pretty much like, oh yeah, how can your consent be violated if, no one, there's no culture of asking for it, there's no conversation.
Yeah, your consent is always considered like implicit in like that South Asian context. And this is especially true. And it like pains me that like in India, marital rape is still like not recognized. It was actually recently shot down by like a lady judge in the High Court. And it's really disappointing because what you're essentially saying, if marital rape can't happen, that means a partner is always consenting to everything that
Mm-hmm.
their partner is doing. And
Mm-hmm.
that like really completely ignores the problem of how many people get sexually or like violently abused by their partners
Mm-hmm.
in our
Yeah, and I
context.
feel like all of this ties into the greater problem of how South Asia can only recognize, like, sex is only bad when it is outside of its extramarital. Consent
Mhm.
is rarely ever a factor in it, right? And the moment you've been married, you've been handed over, and like, you can fuck off, right? But like South Asia literally doesn't, institutionally doesn't care about consent.
And that's what I think allows for so much like coercion to happen
Mm-hmm.
specifically in the South Asian context, because coercion largely happens in spaces where power dynamics are inherent, like family spaces and workspaces.
Mm-hmm.
And we rarely see, like instances of mental and emotional coercion being like even discussed, because like something as simple as, a partner pressurizing their partner into something that they're not comfortable with,
Mm-hmm.
that's like not even considered like a problem you
Mm-hmm.
know
And they're not considered like aspects of non-consent, right? But
hmm
coercion is lack of consent. Like, people think that if you do a good enough job of convincing someone and they say yes, then that's good enough. But it's
yeah,
not.
then that means that they consented, and this is like such a sort of obtuse view of
Mm-hmm.
consent.
To sort of backtrack, like, we were just saying that consent needs to be verbal, but again, what we were saying that sometimes even when
There's
it's
no space
verbal,
to,
yeah, even when it is verbal, it's not consent. And
or
I,
it's forcibly
yeah,
verbalized.
mm-hmm, yeah,
And when it's forcibly verbalized, what we're actually missing is the power dynamics of how that consent is given or taken.
mm-hmm,
And like, usually in such a situation, the person whose consent is being coerced doesn't have the power to act freely or like withdraw or like, say no essentially.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that we see coercion in varieties of ways. Not It's not always like blackmail or like yelling at someone and whatnot. We'll see coercion through like false promises of marriage in South Asia, which may not sound like a big deal in like in the West, but like, or like to the diaspora, but in South Asia, like, false promises of marriage and not being a virgin could literally mean the difference between a girl having a future and not having a future.
hmm Or a girl just facing like brutal violence from
Mm-hmm.
her like husband, the person who actually does marry her, or
Yeah,
like her in-laws, or like, all of those people.
yeah, and I think that like that. Oftentimes it's seen as like, oh yeah, like how can that be like a form of coercion? But it is a coercion when South Asia is a culture that puts so much at stake on virginity.
Yeah, and just like it's a coercion, like, oh, if your boss tells you you'll like, if you sleep with me, I'll get you promoted. That's
Mm-hmm.
coercion because that's taking advantage of a power dynamic, and that's promising something in return. That's
Mm-hmm.
not like voluntarily given consent.
Yeah.
It's not like consent isn't a tit for tat game. Like, let's
Mm-hmm.
be like clear on that.
Yeah, and true consent is voluntary. And I think that's something that we want to reiterate over and over, that even when it seems like it's hard to gauge consent, the very first question you should ask is that, is it voluntary? Does this person have any reason to feel like they're pressurized, you know? And this is to, like, you
Mhm.
know, like, we might have younger audiences, and like, I think, like, as we talk about a lot of these things, it might feel like a bit overwhelming, that, like, oh, like, I thought it's just a yes or no, then why does it get more complicated? Like, why won't women just say it? And it's like, I think there's a level of self-reflection that anyone who's engaging in any, like, sort of like sexual behavior should be able to do.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, even for us as adults, like, I think I have thought about, like reflected on my like sexual encounters. And there
Mhm.
have been instances where I've had to question whether my consent or my partner's were like fully voluntary. And that's a disturbing thing to have to engage
Mhm.
with, but it's also equally important because until we don't, like, how will we know how our consent looks like or what truly voluntary consent should look like?
Mhm. And I think that this brings us to like another area where, like, you know, like consent may be a little confusing to navigate. You know, like queer spaces are an example of this. And we touched a little bit on it in the last episode. But, you know, like when you're a queer person, consenting is not just saying yes to a cup of tea, because you need to make
Mhm.
sure the person who's giving you tea isn't trying to out you and trying to like harm you like physically, right? And like queer consent is so much more focused on like nonverbal cues, and the courtship, you know, like you have to be so careful through it all because you don't want to out yourself to the wrong person. Yeah, like.
Yeah, and I think like the fact that, even in the West, conversations and like conceptualizations of consent are so restricted to heteronormative and patriarchal ideas of how relationships between adults should be. Queer relationships often have very different power dynamics and different ways of negotiating and verbalizing or expressing consent.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that like it's, I mean, you know, it's really dumb to place that sort of heteronormative version of consent on everyone when that's not the world that they experience, right? And we can see this even in like sort of the lack of consent for queer people, right? We can see like how like the gender of the abuser impacts how like sexual abuse or like violence or violations of consent is like perceived. Like men often don't realize, you know, like when their partners are using coercive techniques, you know, to gain consent, and that's because it's not talked about often, or how sexual abuse by women is considered less bad.
Yeah, we've
Yeah.
all seen that video of that kid. Like, I think it's like gut wrenching, rather, video of this man who's, saying, oh, yeah, rape is bad when it happens to women. And he's talking about like him being like
Mm-hmm.
sexually assaulted as a child by his like teacher, and how all of his friends are basically saying,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you're a dude, you're a teenage dude, so you basically want this, right? And that's
Yeah.
how like even male sexuality is often like so warped against men when
Mm-hmm.
they're facing like
Yeah.
violations of
Yeah,
consent.
and I
And
think like that's the thing, that super patriarchal and heteronormative ideas of like sex and consent, it negatively ends up affecting everyone involved. And like, you know, sort of
mhm,
going back to like queer people again, like reporting sexual assault for queer people is like not even an option sometimes, because like, you
mhm,
know, it's almost a greater risk to their safety, like, you know, from than the assaulters themselves. Like law enforcement is often a greater risk to their safety. And the thing is that the queer community, particularly trans people of color, are often like the most at risk of like, you know, like a sexual assault, rape, and violence, like, you know. And the thing is that they have far less resources available than anybody else.
mhm.
Mhm.
The other thing with like, queer consent and like reporting sexual assault, like when you're a queer person, is that even if like our countries are slowly decriminalizing, being gay or being queer, um, law enforcement and institutions are still very
Mhm.
homophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic.
Mhm.
So they, even if the law provides them some security, the institutions rarely like practice providing that
Mhm.
security, right?
Yeah, and I think that we saw it in like some of the movies we discussed before, like whether it's like or TV shows, like we saw it in Made in Heaven, saw it in Nana Avanella Avalu, we saw it
Mm-hmm.
in like, but this is like a repeated problem, and it's not very far from the reality of it. Um, but yeah, I think this brings us to our next movie, which was kind of like we really wanted to see a movie that looks at sort of like consent in queer spaces in South Asia. And
Mm-hmm.
the movie that we got to pick for it was LOEV, like from Netflix.
It's kind of set up as a young, like millennial gay romance, and we see this young man called Sahil and his relationship with two men, Jay and Alex, and it's a slightly more non-monogamous setting. And I
Mhm.
think it was really interesting to sort of see them experience romance in all its, awkwardness of youth, especially in the context of South Asia, and
Mhm.
those little like fun depictions
Yeah, it
of
was.
like being in a queer
Mhm.
relationship in South Asia.
Yeah, and I really like the bits like where we got to see the imagery of them, like like doing things that like going on dates and like whatnot in a South Asian setting. I don't think I can ever have enough of it. Like it's always
Yeah,
very
no.
exciting to see.
Or
Um,
even like mundanely like fighting. I think the
yeah,
starting scene is them like fighting over the electricity bill.
yeah,
That was like super like
yeah,
cute because it's a very like everyday
yeah.
reality for a lot of
Mhm.
relations. But yeah, I think the movie itself and like Sahil, who's the main character, never really seem very clear on how his relationship with Jay particularly is and what those boundaries of that relationship are. Like, are they friends? Are they something more? It's never like spelled out for us. And this wasn't confusing because they weren't monogamous. It was just like never easy to read their behavior towards each other. And I
Mhm.
think a lot was said in a lot of moments of silence and action and just maybe didn't come through as
Mhm.
clearly in the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think it was, nice to see the more pleasant moments between the two of them, but it was also heartbreaking to see all of it culminated in like a violent rape scene where Jay forces himself on Sahil. And the movie never quite reaches a resolution on that and kind of moves on from it in a very blasé way. And I mean, I don't know, the movie felt like it was simultaneously trying to be about a lot of things while
Mhm.
being about like nothing. And one of the elements of it that like I particularly kept thinking about a lot is that, like with the specifically the scene that transpired, Jay like spends the first half of the movie being very like on edge and like just like
Mhm.
about work, this, that, and Sahil's very like, fun loving and
Goofy. Yeah.
goofy and whatnot. But like it almost feels this it's like this resentment and this anger that keeps building that is like that sort of like very stereotypical like sort of not violent male expression of like
Mhm.
emotion, like which
Mhm.
I feel like I don't know, it felt kind of like disturbing how they just really glossed over it in the movie because the after the scene happens, Jay doesn't like apologize. He says, "You can stay if you want." And it's almost doing that thing, right? That like, oh, the burden of forgiving me is on you. The burden of deciding how you feel about it is on you. Like I don't wanna like I don't wanna even apologize first, which felt really sad because you see this movie where they're like, pretty much doing these nice things together. Um
Yeah, and even when he does like verbalize that he did something fucked up, we sort of see a glimmer of that in
mhm,
the end where he like kind of like indirectly admits that he did like a really bad thing.
mhm.
It's still like it's still done in that very
Yeah,
emotionally blackmailing way where
yeah,
like, oh, look at me, I'm feeling so sad about the bad thing that I did, so please
mhm,
like comfort me, your abuser,
yeah.
from like my own guilt,
Mhm.
like
Yeah, and I think that another thing is that I mean, to contextualize it for our listeners, like Jay is also seen to be very a lot more financially well off, and also supposedly paying for like Sahil's like like life to a degree, like not like
Or
in a
like his joy trips, like
yeah,
these vacations that
yeah,
they
or like
take
their
together.
or Sahil's like electric bill and whatnot, right? Jay is financially supporting Sahil to a degree, and Jay is also older than Sahil, and I think there was this just power dynamic issue that was there that also made it like harder for Sahil to like like I mean there's also an emotional aspect of it because Sahil was a lot more sort of in love
Attached.
attached to
Yeah.
Jay, and
Yeah.
so we end up with this situation where Sahil is the victim, but like his consent like is also violated in a setting where the power dynamic does not lean like his way, and like or it's not equal, like the power dynamic is not equal, and I think that makes it like a lot more worse.
Yeah, and the fact that like he was just essentially expected to get over it, like
Mm-hmm.
even by the movie's like plot and like narrative, it was just like, oh yeah, shit's too bad this happened to you, like
Mm-hmm.
sorry, like, and just kind of like it's very abrupt, very unsettling. And
Mm-hmm.
because this like scene was very close to the end, and we never really get, even as an audience, to process
Mm-hmm.
exactly like how horrible it was.
Yeah, and I think like this makes me think about like the hierarchy of the value of consent in general, because like upper caste, upper class, privileged men, like their consent is always valued the most in society, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that like this is in how like Jay values his consent more than like he values like Sahil's, because Sahil is less financially well off than Jay. But also like looking at how like straight men will often have really violent reactions to like queerness because they think that, oh, like I don't want to be like, I don't want some guy to hit on me. And it's like, if straight men are so good at understanding consent when it comes to them, and they should be, why is it the only time that they talk about it is to justify their like homophobia?
Or when they want to feign ignorance and call
Mm-hmm.
consent like confusing when it's really not.
Yeah, and the thing is that after, upper class, upper caste men, it's always the privileged women, whether it's like racially, caste based, class based, like
Mm-hmm.
that's the next step on the ladder. And like we see it in like white women or like upper caste women all the time, where like, their consent, or like it's not actually their consent. I think that'd be wrong to say that, but their bodily
The
autonomy and
mhm.
is seen as something that needs to be protected, right?
Nationally and like
Mm-hmm.
community, throughout the community, like it's
Mm-hmm.
a matter of community and national honor. And
Mm-hmm.
never, I mean, it still like completely dehumanizes them because their bodily autonomy is about like everything else apart from how they feel about it.
Yeah, there's like the fertile grounds for like like crops, and then there's the fertile women for your like national babies, and like that's how they see that it's
Essentially.
essentially seen as a violation of resources, never as like it's never given a humanity, I think, is the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And but I mean, not to say that there's still a privilege in that, because you're still being protected under it,
Mm-hmm.
which I
But
think,
in like a really up
yeah, in a
way,
fucked up
regardless.
way. But I think that it's important to make that distinction, because when you're on the bottom step of the ladder, when you are someone of a marginalized caste, or when you're of a working class position, or when you are like someone who like isn't heteronormative in any sort of way, you get even less, you get dirt, essentially. Like your consent doesn't matter, because what are you gonna do, right?
And this
Especially.
is why, like, like the stats on like sexual assaults against like queer people or women from like marginalized caste or class backgrounds are like the worst. Like, they are the most like vulnerable to
Mhm.
sexual assault and sexual violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that another element of this that we need to touch on, like, and we talked about it a little bit before, is that class grants the privilege of space as well, and thus, privacy, right? Like you are a
Mhm.
lot more like what we were saying a little while ago, that, oh yeah, like locking our bedroom door. Sometimes you'll have families of 10 living in one space, or like many, many women or many, many men living in like a shared like living situation, right? And
Mhm.
in those scenarios, like your bodily autonomy and your ability to consent to be like seen, or like, just,
Yeah,
yeah,
if
it's like
like, like your
compromised.
living room is like 8 beds, like all next to each other, where is
Mhm.
your like privacy or bodily autonomy, you
Yeah,
know?
and the thing is that, like, while, these upper class spaces will see growth on recognizing consent, much of this like is very it's very insulated, right? Like it's
Mm.
never ever very aware of like the struggles of like people from like marginalized spaces, nor will it ever reach them. Like the growth that happens here won't ever reach them because that attempt isn't being made. um
Yeah, and we see this also, like, I mean, when we think of, sex workers
mhm,
and their consent, like, sex workers tend to be women from more marginalized backgrounds. And we saw this, even in Parched with Bijali's character,
mhm,
where she's shown to be like, violently assaulted by like multiple men, but her consent is always considered like implicit because they're paying her for a service. So
mhm,
sex workers rarely get to like, ever like express consent or withdraw consent,
mhm.
especially if they're not like, an independent like person, if they're
or
in a
or just even in our setting where sex work is criminalized, there's no recourse for
yeah,
like.
you're gonna get like it's the same. You're gonna get like probably threatened or assaulted by the law
Mhm.
enforcement,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that there's one more thing that, like institutionally, this institutional vulnerability, and do like, ideas of consent and everything. Like
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about this, I think it's important to not miss out talking about sort of disability and consent, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
consent in differently able people is almost always devalued, like to a horrendous degree.
Mm-hmm.
And it falls into this, like, like it's like partially because they're asexualized, but also even when they are assaulted, they're rarely given the space or to voice their like sort of like issues or their like, like experiences.
Yeah, and I think they're also disadvantaged in terms of like expressing their lack of consent, right? Because able-bodied perpetrators
Mhm.
can like very easily like disrespect or violate that. They're more likely to violate their consent because they're more vulnerable in that
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, and I think that we also see the like issue of when a differently able person is dependent on a caregiver, and oftentimes the caregiver will reject their bodily autonomy and desexualize them because it benefits the caregiver, and this is like a layer of like sort of like dehumanization that not only like robs someone of like sexual agency, but also like takes away their ability to consent, you know?
And yeah, I think like with differently abled people, it's also like really fucked up because they're completely socially desexualized until like someone wants to fetishize them or take advantage of them. So they're like dehumanized, like in consenting. So there's like no sort of space for them to really like talk about these issues. And we don't see like portrayals, like very sensitive portrayals of this in the media. I
Mhm.
think like the last couple of movies that we've seen that talked about differently able people were made like really uncomfortable like portrayals and narratives. Like I'm remembering Bulbul, where like the differently able like twin is the one who's like the sexual assaulter, and that was such a demonizing, like needlessly demonizing portrayal of differently able people, I
Mhm.
thought.
Yeah, when we look at consent and conversations of consent, and like when we go back to the D stuff over and over again, which, like I'm not like bashing the tea thing, but like I'm just saying that like when someone says no to their tea, it might be heard a lot louder than someone else. and that element
Pretty
of
much.
and that intersectionality of it should be kept in mind.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the fact that some no's mean more than other no's, like that's
Mhm.
just that's a horrible truth, but it's something that we need to be like cognizant
Mhm.
of, right?
Yeah, and I think like this brings us to like sort of, like we really wanted to talk about this topic, but I think that this brings us to the part of the episode that I think everyone sort of anticipated that we talk about because there's I think no getting around talking about consent in South Asia without talking about Bollywood. And I think
I
before
think
we get into like our movie pick, which also was a doozy, we I think
oh
want
my
to talk about
gosh.
like item songs. They're such a staple of like non-consent in like Bollywood and how it glorifies non-consent. I
Oh
think we
yeah.
should talk about that.
Yeah, and I mean, item songs are literally made for male consumption of women's bodies and sexualities, you know? I mean, we never see an item dancer as a full character ever in any of these movies. They'll just show up for that one song and dance where they're
Hmm.
like sexualized by everyone, but nothing about their character, why they are doing this, what got them here, what they want out of their life is ever shown like in any
Hmm.
of these movies, right?
Yeah, and then we have that male gaze of it again, like it's the men on the screen consuming them, it's the men behind the camera and the men and the women sometimes in the audience, right?
Mhm.
I think that, these item songs we like talk about in our post, but like these item songs objectify women in both their lyrics, their outfits, and just their premise. There's always a theme to an item song for some reason, and it's all very objectifying.
It's always like comparing women to some like object
Yeah,
that can be consumed.
inanimate object, or a thing,
Something to be
yeah, yeah,
consumed always.
mutton, chicken,
Yeah.
this, that, whatnot. Like there's so many like things that like people like pretty much anything but a human.
Yeah,
Um,
and always something to like signal their promiscuity, like,
mhm.
oh, these are like slutty women. They're
Yeah.
sluttier than
And
your
the
wife.
thing is that you can be
Yeah.
like, oh, it's all entertaining and shit, like you can just watch it and move on. But there's often these don't come just to like objectify women. There's often a caste and class based fetishization that happens in item numbers, right? You'll often have
Mhm.
these very light skinned upper class actresses, adorned in sort of clothes who of like working class women, or like women of
Mhm.
certain professions, or like as sex workers, and then you'll have them dance away and in like a sexualized version of the outfit, and
Mhm.
then and this perpetuates this like sort of like ideas of like like sexual misconduct against poor women being like okay, because they're like, oh yeah, like that's the imagery you associate those like clothes with when they're just functional clothes, like that's it. Like a thinking of like Katrina Kaif, like Sheila Ki Jawani, or like like,
Mhm.
or just I'm just like Muni Badnaam Hui, like all of them. Like there's always this class
Mhm.
element to it that like I think that it is not talked about enough. I think when critiques of item songs come up. Um,
Yeah, and you would think that, like with all of Bollywood's nepotism, there would be some actresses who just don't need to resort to like doing item numbers.
mhm.
But that's also not true because literally, even like the superstars of Bollywood or whatever, like including people like Kareena Kapoor or like Priyanka Chopra or like Bipasha
Deepika,
Basu,
yeah.
yeah, Deepika Padukone. All of these people
Mhm.
have had to do item songs at one
Mhm.
point or another to like increase their like appeal to
Mhm.
like a
Or
larger
just
audience.
survive in the industry, right?
Yeah,
Like,
because like sexualization is like part of their job description,
mhm.
essentially.
Yeah, which is really sad because like even beyond item songs, like we're getting out of the item songs thing. We will link an article that does a better job of like talking about it. But or just like problematic lyrics and whatnot. I think we can see like how like like you ever think about Bollywood movies, and there's always like a scene where the actresses' clothes are like soaking wet for like no context reason whatever. She'll be wearing a super semi sheer like shari, and then she'll have like her sari like soaking wet, right?
And
And
then she'll feel the urge to dance in
yeah,
like her soaking wet
yeah,
clothes,
and like
obviously.
and oftentimes it'll be like her alone dancing for some reason.
Or her thinking that she's alone, but
Yeah.
she's actually being watched by some creepy man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing is that yeah, she doesn't know that she's being watched by like someone secretly, and that's part of the allure of the scene, right? Like I remember Ashoka, like yeah, like
Oh
Kareena
yeah, oh my
Kapoor,
god,
yeah,
Karina Kapoor's
yeah,
bath in the river. Oh my god.
yeah, and like I remember Ashoka, or even like I think DDLJ, where like Kajol is dancing in the rain, and the actor is in there, but the audience gets to peek in, like voyeuristically. There's a
Mm-hmm.
like you get to be in a higher position of power immediately when you're a voyeur, because they're not supposed to be in a scene where they think they're being seen, but
Mm-hmm.
we get to see them during that time, right? And I think it's just, I don't know, like it's always very scary to me how popular it is, this idea of like
Mm-hmm.
looking at a woman when she isn't looking at you. Like, why is
When
that
she
the
doesn't know you're there. Yeah, like that violation of privacy is like
Mhm.
hot for some reason, you know?
Yeah, and like, other like than that, there's just so much. But like other than that, there's always the classic, relentlessly pursuing women that is like glorified on screen. Like
Mm-hmm.
no means yes, no means,
Yeah,
yeah.
she's just playing hard to get. It's
Yeah.
always like hard to get.
And
Yeah.
like you can find that it's like pretty much a thing. It's the premise of pretty much most movies from like South Asia. Like most popular movies in South Asia, it's about how to win the girl when she says no to you.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it is, women are constantly, everyone is sexualized. All women are sexualized, but women are constantly still like divided into that Madonna and whore like kind of duality. So the good girl doesn't deserve to be sexualized, and therefore, like her like being assaulted or harassed is a bad thing. But when the slutty girl is being like sexualized or assaulted, then she was obviously just like asking for it. And this kind of like goes back into that hierarchy of consent, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
And I think that the thing is that this is also where the item number comes into play, right? Because like you don't have to sexualize the girl, the love interest, to
Mhm.
find the item girl hot. That's what they're called, the item girls. But
Yeah.
horrendous. But
Yeah,
like,
and like the term item itself, like literally means thing, and it's
yeah.
used as like a means of
Mm-hmm.
catcalling women, right?
Yeah.
Like, like we've all seen those like portrayals of like five dudes on a bike, like
Mhm.
calling a girl an item or mal when they're walking
Mhm.
by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is that, like, like when over and over and over, you see women after like women only exist on screen to serve as objects of affection for men, or as a prize to be won, or like, you get to see the few brief seconds of like sexual defilement, because, God forbid a woman is, naked on screen consensually during a consensual sex scene. The only way
Mm-hmm.
where you can validly see an actress's like skin is when she's being violently, like her consent is being violently violated. um but yeah, like you never, you keep seeing these things, and you never you just learn to see women as objects, right? Because like you only see women and you have a specific set goal for that woman, like to win her, make sure she doesn't get raped, like maybe catch a glimpse of
Mm-hmm.
her when she is, and then you win her, and that's the goal. And then you end up sort of starting to envision yourself as the hero of your life. We all do. But the thing is that when you keep watching movies like this, you think that you're the hero and there's just a girl that you haven't convinced hard enough to like win over.
Yeah, and like it keeps going back to that like division of women, like the binarization of what
Mm-hmm.
women can be, because the love interest or the nice girl is never deserves it.
Mm-hmm.
But like as soon as a girl is talking to boys or she's wearing jeans or Western clothing,
Or is mingling with the opposite sex, like she is suddenly deserving of like horrible
violence.
violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, and the thing is that these movies, this objectification ends up with this sort of like having reductive one-dimensional ideas of women, right? Because you see X and you think that woman is Y, and you're never able to break out of that sort of like headspace.
Hmm.
And that whole relentless pursuing thing, I mean, there's so many things, and I think like we're trying to list as many as we can. I mean, we do want to touch on the fact eve teasing is a giant, like a huge problem in
Hmm.
like South Asia, and like
And
for
eve
those.
teasing, like to be clear, is just verbal sexual harassment.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
eve teasing is a very like simplified and like
Yeah.
very innocent like name for it. It's verbal
Hmm.
sexual harassment.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
thing is that like literal like adult age men will like line up around girls' high schools and sometimes middle schools. It's very gross. And they'll like just pinpoint a girl and they'll pretend like that girl is the heroine of their movie. And then
And,
they'll badger them like
and stalk them
and
and
stalk
threaten
them and
them.
threaten them. Yeah. Like until like, like they've pushed her to agree. And and it's really fucked up.
Yeah, and I think like apart from like normalizing women's objectification for men, it really warps women's ideas of how romance and courtship and love should look like. Because if you think that like being stalked is like flattering, then your entire idea of like a relationship is pretty much based on a culture of patriarchal abuse, right?
Mhm.
And like the overarching impact of this is like completely disrespecting any and all ideas of consent, and it's just really horrifying in our
Mhm.
context.
Yeah, and speaking of horrifying, I mean, we're gonna do like a fan favorite on this like next week, so that we'll get to cover like non-consent in Bollywood like very in depth. But before we spoil that like choice, we do want to talk about the movie for this week, which I mean, okay, to be honest, when I picked it, I was just trying to find a movie. I did not like even I didn't think I have to watch it, but and I didn't think it'd be this ludicrous when I like looked up the plot, like of the movie.
Oh my
And I
god.
think when I finally saw the plot, like I was just like, what? Uh, it was very like it was. I will say, like I didn't think for it was possible for a movie to be this problematic to this many people in one like go. Before
Oh
we
my
get into the
gosh.
consent part of it, I do want to touch on the fact that this is an inner race. We get to see like interfaith relationships in it, which is done
In a
so much
really fucked
in
up
a really fucked up
way.
way. We get
Oh
to
my
see
gosh.
a creepy guy, who is, like played by Dhanush. This is his debut film, which is great. He's a good actor, but I think there's something a little problematic about casting a dark-skinned actor to be the
Play the creepy
creepy guy
guy.
who's pursuing the pretty North Indian actress Sonam
Yeah,
Kapoor.
it
Yeah.
plays right back into those casteist, classist like
Mhm.
ideas of all of this,
Yeah,
right? Like,
and like that North Indian hegemony idea of it too,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, so this movie is about like a boy from this very like conservative Hindu Brahmin family. His name's Kundan and he's played by Dhanush. And he falls in love with this Muslim girl played by Sonam Kapoor
Yeah, he
called
sees
Zoya.
her like as a child and falls in love. It's just sort
Yeah,
of
he's
this.
instantly fixated with her.
Mhm. And then he stalks her for like 10, 15 years. Like,
Yeah, essentially that's like the movie's plot, like
mhm.
his unrequited love and it resulting in like all of
Yeah.
this stalking and creepiness. And this movie is like chock a block full of like,
Yeah, no, there's literally a line in it. Like after, so the first time he like tries to pursue her, he's like, he lies to her about being Muslim, which I mean that means he knows that she doesn't want to see anyone who isn't Muslim. So he lies about it, And then when he gets caught and whatnot, he this is a literal dialogue where he's like, "Oh, there's only two ways to get women, you know. The first is to relentlessly pursue them, even when they say no over and over. But that may work for the Shah Rukh Khans of the world. But for people like us, it's number two. We have to scare them into like liking us." And it's like, what the fuck? And that is
And
literally.
that's like every South Asian man's go to, like,
Mhm.
essentially for how do I
Yeah, like
win over the
so
girl?
many girls are threatened with like, "Oh, if you don't say yes to me, I will tell everyone that you're a slut."
Or I'll literally like show up outside your school and like throw acid on you,
You're
or like rape
yeah,
you, or
yeah,
like get my
done.
friends to rape you, you
Yeah,
know?
well, yeah, but no, it's really fucked up that they just make a joke out of it, and then the entire movie is so weird. Like, I don't think I want to recommend anyone watch this movie. I don't want to go into details about the synopsis of it, but I will tell you that it plays into another horrible stereotype where it ends with the Muslim girl literally trying to blow him up.
Yeah, so she's like suddenly this commie Islamic terrorist, like, which also makes zero sense. Like,
It just isn't like, I just don't understand how you can make a movie be that problematic about consent. Like, literally in the middle of the movie, she moves on and is dating someone else and comes back to the hometown like after 5 years or something. And she's like forgotten about him because who remembers like high school shit? And he like is like fixated on like, oh my god, no, I'm good. Like,
win her over. Yeah, I remember like that one scene where he's like literally saying, "Oh, let's get married." And like it really shows how like differing their ideas of
mm-hmm.
their relationship are. They're living in entirely different realities where he's essentially dreaming,
Yeah.
"Oh, we're gonna get married one
And
day.
the
We
thing
were
is,
just separated by our
mm-hmm,
parents." But like, and she's like, "Dude, what the fuck? Like,
mm-hmm.
we were kids. It's over."
Yeah, and the thing is that like through like in the middle of the movie, like as we were saying, she starts dating someone else, and this is another like the Sikh man that she is in love with actively and chooses,
Played
and
by the very obviously hot Abid Deol. I
yeah,
just want to
yeah.
say
No, but like
that.
again, that's problematic too, right? That like, oh, the creepy character is the dark skinned character, and then like Abhay Deol was the other guy, the nice guy, right? And then this
Mhm.
guy, so the thing is that the premise essentially happens where she's gonna marry him. He's supposedly a Muslim. Then Dhanush's character finds out that like, oh, this guy's pretending to be a Muslim, and so he goes and wrecks her wedding because he's just like, no, I'm not gonna let this wedding happen.
Yeah,
My
I'm gonna
last
make a public scene about like him
doesn't
not
talk
being
to her. He doesn't let her decide. He makes a public scene so that her parents beat the shit out of this like guy. You know, again, violent Muslims. But then her parents beat the shit out of this guy, and then she like cries and she tells him that like, oh no, like I told him to pretend to be Muslim, like so that like we could be together. So she had consented to like
that lie.
that
Yeah.
lie, like like even if it was like like that was a lie that they both came to together. And the thing is that
Mhm.
like, and then
It was essentially none of his business to
yeah,
like butt
yeah,
into
and
this.
then
Yeah.
Abhay character like dies, and so she's
Oh my god.
obviously like very pissed off. But then like his whole thing is, I think in his head is like, well, if she was gonna marry a Sikh person, then religion was never the factor. And then he goes finds her again. Like he goes to her campus and like is constantly in her face until she feels the need to blow him up. Like, which is insane for a plot.
Yeah, and this like really goes back to like, how rejecting men always has a cost, like, and that cost can pretty much be from a minor inconvenience to like literally your safety and your life,
Mm-hmm.
because men feel this sense of like entitlement over any and every woman that they will
Yeah.
ever fixate on. And suddenly, like just because I saw you across like the school bus or some shit, like now you belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the narrative that this movie also like ends up perpetuating
Yeah, because
ultimately.
like it's never seen as a in a negative light. Because throughout the movie, I don't know if it's because Sonam Kapoor is a bad actor, but like she like throughout the movie, she's like giggling and like there's always a line that she keeps making it blurry. Where and then there are other moments where she's really put off by him, and it's like I mean I just feel like women aren't that wishy washy on like consent. Like
Yeah, and
empathy.
it's I feel like in the storytelling you can see that like the man's character is given so much more empathy and depth, and the woman's character is just like, random, like just mad, like she just has no mind of her own, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
she's a super feminist who wants like to do things her way, but also when this guy is being creepy towards her, she's gonna indulge in it, and it
Yeah.
makes no sense. And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of like also, I think, feeds into that idea that we were talking about earlier, that women are pretty much socialized to look at all male attention as something to be flattered over, so
Mm-hmm.
they're never really taught to like, set that boundary when they are receiving
Mm-hmm.
unwanted male
But
attention.
the
There's
movies
no
never
way.
shows that in a critical way. Like even there,
Yeah,
it's
it's
never
never
shown like
critical of it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's never critical of the fact that oh Sonam Kapoor is like
being
entertaining this
harassed.
or entertaining this even though she feels uncomfortable. Like it's never shown that way. It's always made to feel like oh look, he's
She
trying
just needs to be convinced
a
a little
little
bit
bit
more.
more. Yeah, like you're just this close, and like I think that makes this movie like just insufferable. But yeah, like, I mean, like I think that to sort of wrap up on this conversation, I think about like more modern movies that are supposedly not bad about consent. Like I was thinking
Hmm.
about like I recently watched Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara, and it's done
Hmm.
by Zoya Akhtar, and it has the whole like like the whole gang of their family and everything involved with the production. And the thing is that Katrina Kaif's character in it is this like manic pixie dream girl who
Who's
so
like supposedly has a lot of autonomy, right?
who's
Because
yeah.
she kisses Hrithik Roshan, so empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, yeah.
Yeah, and she's the one who like pursues Hrithik Roshan and like in it and whatnot, which is like a lot more than any previous like she's like it's a lot more than being the sole object of affection and then being nothing else. Like she's their to scuba trainer and whatnot. So I guess that happens, but like other than that, like I think about it, it's like yeah sure, like she gets a lot more autonomy than any other women that in general Bollywood movies, but also she has to, while hanging out with them, she has to sit through Farhan Akhtar's character like hitting on her like relentlessly.
And just like comedically like indulge it, like
Mhm.
ha ha ha,
Uh-huh,
he's just
yeah,
being cute.
and it's
Yeah.
at one point even I was a little like, dude, like just stop. Like she's not responding. Like
Yeah,
and
and he like essentially, like as soon as he meets like the other Spanish girl where
yeah,
he thinks, oh, he has a shot of getting into her
hmm
pants,
yeah,
he's just like completely stops hitting on her. So she
yeah,
never gets a say in like when she gets starts being sexualized or
yeah,
stops being
yeah.
sexualized.
And I think like the fact that she had to put up with it at all makes me think about how like autonomy even in the modern more feminist steer takes is it's less scary, but it's still a rejection of women's like sort of like
Agency.
agency,
Yeah.
but in a different shape. It's more subtle. And I think when it's more subtle, it's a lot harder for people to understand, because it's easy to convince someone that, like, oh, DDLJ or XY or like, XYZ was problematic. But it's a lot harder to convince someone that, oh, Katrina Kaif's character, oh, if she could kiss Hrithik Roshan, why couldn't she tell Farhan Akhtar to shut up? But like, she was literally like someone who's trying to be make new friends and she didn't want to make things awkward. And I think if to give the movie some credit, it like Zoe Akhtar did show like how uncomfortable she was with it,
Hmm.
but like it never became anything bigger than that. Like we got to
It
see
never
her.
like again like critiqued that
Yeah, she like
behavior very
smiled through. I don't know,
actively.
I think I might have read in the discomfort, but it just seemed like she was just smiling through it for the most part.
Yeah, she was just like putting up with it
Mhm.
because she's like, oh
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
Hrithik Roshan's hot, like I might as well
Yeah.
stick around.
And I think as like, the industries change and conversations around consent like improve, I think we should hope to see like better portrayals of consent on screen. And
We should
hopefully
definitely expect it and hold these
mhm.
people accountable to
Yeah,
it, as we always say.
and we shouldn't just, be like okay with like it just becoming more subtle is what we're trying to say. Like
Yeah, just because it's harder to call out
mhm.
doesn't mean like it shouldn't be called out. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, like to sort of I think that brings us to sort of the end of our episode and to sort of like wrap up here. I think we recognize that the impact that our collective ideas of consent, like, and as how it stands, like it has an impact on purity and rape culture in South Asian like society. And the thing is that, like as we were talking about at the beginning, the feedback loop is real, right? Like when you see like, sexually motivated violence and coercion become normalized or glorified on screen, you think it's okay to do IRL. And then if it's happening IRL, the media just continues to do the same thing over and over again. Like it just continues on.
Yeah, and since like conversations around consent are never explicitly happen beyond consent regarding like sexual activity, even to most adults, consent is something that's very confusing and perplexing to navigate very often. And the thing is, because we don't know what truly voluntary consent can look like, we don't know often how to identify that it's been violated, or like point out that this is how it was violated.
And additionally, I think like with gendered power dynamics, I think that we need to look more at the lack of sexual autonomy for anyone who isn't a cishet male, and also look at how consent is always something that cishet men will like assume in other people, right?
It kind of feeds into how like women are positioned socially as these like fulfillers of male desire, or only there to like cater to male desire. So it constantly assumes consent on their behalf and feeds into that entitlement that cishet men have, which again like leads to that feedback loop of increased sexual violence and harassment almost everywhere.
hmm And I think that this is all just one component of rape culture, one of many, many, many more, but a crucial one, and one that helps set the precedent for justifying and continuing to perpetuate the culture of purity and rape, which are both two sides of the same coin. And we'll be picking up there for our next topic focused episode. And I hope that you'll join us when we have that discussion because it really wraps up the conversation that we started today.
With that, we'll stop here. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Saris on Screen. Make sure to subscribe and drop us some feedback. We're available anywhere that podcasts are platformed. Make sure to also check out our website and follow us on our socials. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next saucy deep dive with Mohabbatein, which is a movie that exemplifies the glorification of non consent in South Asia. It's also another Shah Rukh Khan movie.
Yeah, which seems
So
to be
we'll
like a hit with our audience for some reason. But yeah, no. Also, if anyone is interested, we're planning on doing like a Discord watch party.
this weekend. Yeah.
So we'll probably watch through Amazon Prime watch party. So like, if you want to join us, check out our social media. Until then, bye.